Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to continue talking about the Siddur here. We're on page 96 in our Siddur. We finished talking about benching, the blessing after meals, and we discussed the different technical parts of it, and we discussed the structural part of it, that it's 3 blessings, but really 4 blessings, 3 biblical blessings, 4 and a 4th blessing that was added by the sages after the destruction of the Second Temple. And now we move on to the blessing after certain foods, which is on page 96. So the blessing after meals is one that's recited after a meal in which you had bread. So whenever you wash and eat bread, the blessing to recite afterwards is the long blessing after meals. Generally, sages understood that when a person sits down for any meal, whenever they sit down to eat a meal, the meal is always eaten, you break bread, it's always over bread. And so the blessing after meals is for after your primary meals. But what if you're eating a snack? What if, as is more common today, people are eating meals without having bread? So then there's blessings that we make after certain foods. So first we have this blessing on page 96, and then we'll touch on the blessing here on page 97. So the blessing on page 96, this blessing is called some people call it the Alamichya blessing, because that's the first category here we're going to talk about in a moment. So people call it Alamichya, which means the sustenance. Michya is the sustenance. But the blessing, what it's called in Jewish law, is the blessing Me'ein Shalosh, the blessing that is sort of a taste of 3, or a synopsis of 3. What does that mean, the synopsis of 3? So since we just finished studying about benching, we know the 3 is an allusion to the 3 blessings of the blessing after meals, right? The first 3, which are the biblically mandated and composed blessings in the blessing after meals. So this blessing is like a short version, an abridged version of those, right? The abridged of 3. And let's take a look, and we'll see. If you look in the blessing on page 96, so you'll see that we say that we bless God for the michya, for the sustenance, and truvas hasadon, the produce of the field. So that is an allusion to the first blessing, the blessing of Hazan, that God sustains us, right? Then we say Ba'al Eretz Chemda, right? Toiva urechava, and also for the desirable and good land and vast land that you gave us as an inheritance, right? That is an allusion to the second blessing, Noidelecha, right? The blessing on the land, which was composed when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel. And then we say, Rachim na Hashem Elokeinu Yisrael Amecha Val Yerushalayim Erecha, and God, have mercy on your people Israel and on Jerusalem, your city, which of course we know that's an allusion obviously to the third blessing, which is Rachim, the third blessing of the blessing after meals. Now, in truth, if you look a little further down towards the end of the page, the blessing closes, Ki ata Hashem, because you are God, toiv umeitiv lakol, you're good and do good to all. And of course, you're familiar with that. The fourth blessing, the blessing atoiv umeitiv, which we discussed, that the blessing of God who is good and does good, right? So even though we see that all 4 blessings are alluded to in the structure of this blessing, all 4 blessings, the blessing after meal, this is like the shorter version, the Cliff's Notes version of it. Nevertheless, it's still referred to as the blessing that is Me'ein Shalish, a blessing that is sort of the synopsis or a taste of the 3, since as we've already established, the 3 blessings sort of stand alone in the blessing after meals, since they are, of biblical origins, versus the 4th blessing, which is rabbinic origins and came a lot later. So therefore, it's still called the blessing, which is of 3. Now, let's actually get into this blessing for a moment here. So you see that you've got 3 columns here on the top of the page and as well on the bottom of the page. And that's because this blessing is recited after eating the following foods. So if you had any kind of grain that you would make a mezonot bracha on, right? So what would you make a mezonot on? Remember, we talked about it before benching, when we talked about the blessings before eating. So that would be any food that's made up, that's made with the 5 grains, right? Which would be wheat, barley, rye, oat, and spelt. So anything made of those grains, but not bread. So if those grains were turned into bread, then you'd make a hamotzi, you'd have to wash, and then you'd have to recite the full blessing after meals. But if you use those grains and made something else, you baked a cake, you made cookies, you made something that is not bread, then you would recite a mezonot blessing on it, and you would recite this blessing after eating it. So that blessing that you would recite would be the first column, al hamichya va'al hakakala, on the sustenance and for the nourishment, right? So that category is for grains that are not bread, that when after eating them, you make this blessing and you recite Al HaMichya Al Kol, and then at the end you'd close the blessing with again, because God is good, and we thank Him for the land and for the michya, for the sustenance. Blessed are you, God, for the sustenance, right? So that's that first column would be for grains. The second column is for wine and grape juice. So we've already established also when we were talking in the beginning, before benching, we were talking about the blessings that precede eating. So so there's a special blessing for wine. Wine is singled out from all the other liquids and drinks because of its importance and prominence, and so it gets its special blessing before, and it also gets a special dedicated after blessing. So if you had wine to drink, right, you had more than a revius, which is roughly 3 ounces of wine. So if you drank about 3 ounces of wine, you'd have to recite this blessing afterwards. This is the same, this blessing, but instead of saying Al HaMichya, the first column, you'd move to the second column, which is Al HaGefen Al Pri HaGefen, for the vine and the fruit of the vine, right? So that's this blessing, which obviously, again, the fruit of the vine, that's what we had a drink from the vine. So that's at the end, you'd conclude as well, Al Pri HaGefen, and then again, blessed are you, God, Pri HaGefen, for the fruit of the vine. So that's the second category. So the first category is food of the 5 grains, any kind of pastry that's made of those 5 grains, you'd say Al HaMichya. Any wine that you had or grape juice, you would recite Al HaGefen. And this is only for wine and grape juice, not for whiskey and vodka and other cocktails. This is wine and grape juice on which you made a hagafen. And then finally you have the last column. The last category is Al Ha'etz V'Al Pri Ha'etz, on the fruit and the tree and the fruit of the tree, right? So this blessing is recited if you had one of the other 5 species of which the land of Israel is blessed. So the land of Israel is blessed. We find in the Torah many times, God talks about, extols the virtues of the land of Israel, and he talks about in the Torah in a number of places that there are 7 species of which the land is blessed. So the first 2 are grain, eretz chita, usa'ira, wheat and barley, but the next 5 are fruit, right? What are the next 5? You've got grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. Those are the 5 fruit in which the land of Israel is blessed. So if one eats any of those fruits, which they would make a regular ha'etz blessing on them beforehand, but afterwards also gets this special dedicated blessing in praise of God and the land that he gives us and Jerusalem. So it's very appropriate that if we're eating fruit for which the land is blessed, we would recite this blessing. It ties in nicely with that snack that we may have eaten. So for those 5 fruit, and only those 5, we would recite this blessing as well. Okay, now what happens if you had, you had a cookie, and you also had a sip of wine, and you had pomegranates? What would you do then? So then you would combine all of these into one blessing. That's where you see the bracketed vavs in some of them, which is a prefix of and that's because you would combine them. So let's say if you ate 2 of the 3, whatever combination you had, you would add these, and you would always add it in this sequence, right? So if you didn't know, if you had, let's say, you had a cake and you had a fig, so you'd recite Al HaMichya V'Al HaKalkala for the grain, and then you'd say Ve'al and on Ha'etz V'Al Pri Ha'etz, and the fruit of the tree and the fruit of the tree, and then at the end you'd again close Al HaMichya V'Al HaPeiros, right? So that's how this blessing would be combined. If you had all 3, you do all 3. If you had 2, you did 3, and you just that's kind of self-evident how you can go through combining these different blessings. You've done them. Of course, in the middle you have a gray area, which is where we would add if it's a special day. So if it's Shabbos, you'd add a mention for Shabbos. If it's Rosh Chodesh, you add a special mention for Rosh Chodesh, and so on. That's what you have in the gray area here in the middle, which is insertions for the special day if you're doing this on one of those holidays. Okay, let's move on to page 97, and this is the blessing Borei Nefashot. Borei Nefashot. This blessing is a blessing that we recite over any other food. So any food that's not in that category. In other words, it's not bread, so we didn't recite a blessing after meal. It's not a grain of the 5 grains based sort of pastry or other kind of prepared food. So it's not an al michya. It's not wine or grape juice. It's not an al gefen. It's not the 5 fruits of the land of Israel. Because so it's not al ha'etz v'al pri ha'etz. Everything else, this is the after blessing. This short blessing, 3 lines here, where we thank God for all the things that He creates, and creating them and all of their needs that they can then be satisfied. So that's this blessing. It's a short blessing. Anytime when anybody eats anything that's not included in any of those above mentioned categories, this is the blessing that we would recite afterwards. Okay, so that's